This box has treasure in it. Hi everybody, I'm Kent. Welcome to the Magic Box Book Club. So a while ago I acquired this box. What's inside is a lot of vintage UFO and sci-fi books from the 60s. It's a lot of them. It's really interesting stuff. So I'm really in love with this kind of thing. It's a particular genre of book containing ostensibly true stories about UFOs, paranormal encounters, exorcisms, and all manner of strange and wonderful things. These type of stories especially appeal to younger minds, under the guise of being groundbreaking studies of paranormal and fringe phenomena. So it's fitting that the book I'm reviewing today is called Children of the Supernatural by Robert Tralins. It fell apart while I was reading it, which gives you kind of a sense of its age. This was originally published in 1969. If you look at the binding on this book, you'll notice that the edges of the pages are dyed purple, and what that means is that this is a Lancer book. Lancer was a publisher in operation until 1973 that did a lot of these pulp works. It also was the publisher of the Conan the Barbarian series. Robert Tralins, who I had not heard of prior to reading this book, was an extremely prolific author of 251 works. He lived in Florida, was generally a pulp author, and was a contemporary of L. Ron Hubbard. One of his first books was called Pleasure Is My Business. It was a diary of a Florida madam named Madam Sherry, and this book was banned. The Supreme Court deemed it obscene, and then the Supreme Court reversed its decision in a landmark ruling. So the Supreme Court actually found that the book had redeeming qualities to it, and one of the quotes from the 1964 ruling in the Supreme Court's reversal says, "Prostitution by certain flowers of the community and the graft which acts as fertilizer for their bloom are certainly of great import in the area of planting and growth, i.e. Dade County, if not nationally also." I've read that several times and it still confuses me. Furthermore, King Farouk of Egypt sued Tralins for libel over this same book. So the book claims that King Farouk had gone to Florida to visit Madam Sherry. King Farouk sued Tralins for libel, saying that he had never been in the United States. Now, according to Wikipedia, everything I've said so far, I've been able to verify. According to Wikipedia, which I've not found any other verification, Tralins then produced evidence that King Farouk had been in the United States and won a judgment of $750,000 against him. In the following years, Tralins continued to write erotic works such as Invasion of the Nymphomaniacs and The Topless Kitties, although these works were under the pen name Sean O'Shea. Tralins also wrote numerous books about sales, spy novels, science fiction novels, a lot of books of paranormal phenomena, and also, and this is kind of uncomfortable, and also a number of titles which belong to a category which the website Trash Minutes calls slavesploitation or plantation exploitation. This is kind of, if you have seen the movie Django Unchained, that's kind of the modern flowering of this genre. According to this website, again, Trash Menace, this is a genre set in the 19th century and usually involving a proper white woman having sexual relations with a black slave. Titles in this genre are, quote, trashy and exploitative to the bone, but they at least acknowledge the evils of slavery. Titles which Robert Tralins contributed to this genre include Slave King, Black Pirate, Panther John, Runaway Slave, aka Rampage, Black Stud, aka Black Brute, Slave's Revenge, Black Roots, and Chains. Without further ado, let's dive right into Children of the Supernatural. Here is what the back cover of this book has to say about it. they walk with angels. Are the young and innocent especially in tune with the spirit world? Are they uniquely receptive to occult signals that save them from tragedy or bring joy to their elders? Here in these amazing pages, you will find documented accounts of children, some mere babies, who have landed airplanes unaided, seen through walls, astrally projected themselves to help reunite estranged parents, performed death-averting acts of levitation. In short, children who have astounded scientists with deeds almost too incredible to be true. Yet the cases herein reported by occult authority Robert Tralins have occurred, and in our own time. So the insistence that these things actually occurred is not confined to the back cover. We don't know anything about Robert Tralins' methodology, and unfortunately the book is not very helpful on this point. There's no bibliography, there's no list of sources, there's nothing of the sort. The book makes up for it with Tralins' repeated insistence that these things actually happened. As to how little Michael Hall so accurately described what was happening miles away from his bedroom while asleep, no one is able to tell, but the fact remains, it did happen. Imagination or what? The fact remains, it did happen. Who believes a 13-year-old when she confirms such a wild story as that? Nevertheless, it did happen. As to how the boys vanished and reappeared again, no one can say, but the fact is, it did happen. How did Mark originally arrive at his conviction that he would die in such a tragic manner? No one knows, but it happened. Whether or not Luisa Flores's uncanny ability was due to some supervision or some supernatural power will never be known. However, it did happen. But whatever the reason for the boy's disappearance, it happened. Today, Joey is a grown man, and he is no longer afraid to talk about it, and he admits that it wasn't a mistake after all. It really happened. Of course, this is only a legend, but what happened that night when the two teenage girls were rescued isn't a legend. It really happened, and the girls are alive to swear to it. In addition to being super insistent that everything in his book actually happened, Robert Tralins has what I consider to be a kind of adorable literary trait of putting an exclamation point often at the beginning of the first sentence of his work, certainly within the first paragraph. In fact, of the 50 stories contained in this book, 22 of them have an exclamation point within the first paragraph. Now, as insistent as Robert Tralins is, one thing that I think is kind of admirable about this book is that he does not proselytize. While he does attribute some of the stories to the power of prayer, quote unquote, he doesn't really preach anything about it. He refrains from editorial comment for the most part. When he's not insisting that things are true, he's questioning the fabric of reality, but he's never really putting forth a thesis other than that children, because of their innocence, are more capable of seeing and participating in the supernatural realm, and that as they lose their innocence, like often as they become teenagers and they become scared of retribution or of social castigation, they just lose their power. So it's interesting to note that, this was written in 1969. A lot of things were being questioned about social structures, etc. So in addition to just being really insistent that these things happen, he also questions things that we would consider to be normal. For example, he says, "But dolls can't talk, or can they?" on page 172. So while my own feeling is that these stories are pretty dubious, they seem that way, and there is no source material to really trace them back with, and I did do Google searches for a number of the names listed, and did not come up with anything. Google didn't exist in 1969, so Tralins gives everything the appearance of being documented by providing a date in most stories. And in fact, I think all of the stories have a date, a full name of the participants, the age, and the place that it happened. And these things are not confined to the US, these things happened all over the world. And I'll be sharing a couple of them with you today as a part of this Magic Box book review or book club. I forgot what I said earlier, so whichever it is. Another thing that makes me question whether these stories may be a little bit dubious is that the dates appear to be somewhat arbitrary. And the way I came to this conclusion is in Story 18, The Incident of the Disappearing Orphans. Robert Tralins writes, out of the Holocaust of war, there always arise many uncanny and weird tales, but perhaps none are more weird than one which happened in March 1966 in Saigon, Vietnam. So here he does the thing where he is telling you where something happened, he's telling you the date that it happened, allegedly. However, if you read the story, nothing interesting happened in March of 1966. It says that March of 1966 is really when Staff Sergeant Marvin E. Wells and Corporal Douglas L. Goldsmith were assigned by their commanding officer to assist at the refugee camp in maintaining order and aiding the staff there to process the children. However, nothing supernatural happened until August 1966. So the opening statement that in March 1966 weird stuff happened does make it appear that these dates are fairly arbitrary, in addition to everything just being so ridiculous. So I wanted to share with you some of the stories in this book, and so I will read and comment on two of them. The first one here is called The Living Toy Miracle. It is story number 39. In an orphanage in Hong Kong late one Christmas Eve in 1953, three utterly astonished nuns saw a parade of toys marching into a children's dormitory! ! As they watched, they could not believe their eyes, for the toys were moving as though by some supernatural power. The evening it happened, Sister Magdalene and two other nuns were returning to the orphanage with empty hands after making an unsuccessful attempt to obtain some toys for the 23 little homeless orphan waifs in their charge. One of the nuns remarked, "Wouldn't it be nice if some kind benefactor surprised the children with a gift of toys? Wouldn't that be wonderful?" "Yes," one of the sisters said, "but that's wishful thinking." I don't know why I'm giving them that accent. They're in Hong Kong. The conversation was overheard by a little plump Chinese who was standing near them on the bus they were all riding. He bowed and smiled at each of the sisters in turn and inquired, "Honorable sisters, may I humbly ask if you will forgive me for listening to you, but did I hear you say you wanted some toys for the orphan children?" The sisters nodded and looked at him hopefully. There was something friendly and strangely familiar about the old gentleman in his bright red kimono and skull cap, but they couldn't place him. This is an interesting observation. This kind of thing, once you hear the whole story, will make you think that this is more of a literary device than an actual story that someone reported to him. "Yes," Sister Magdalene replied. "It's going to be a bleak Christmas for our little orphan children. We had problems enough getting clothing and food and medical care for them, and it seems there isn't money enough left over from our budget to buy toys. We waited this long because we are hoping for a miracle. I guess it's too late for that now." The bus pulled to a stop, and the old Chinese bowed and hastened to disembark. As he did so, he turned and with a twinkle in his eyes said, "Don't give up hope. It isn't Christmas yet." 2 hours later, at 11 o'clock that night, just after the three sisters had looked in on the children in the dormitory, they walked outside for a breath of air. A few minutes later, one of them looked through the window and saw the most incredible sight she had ever seen in her life. She was speechless, and she gestured to the others and pointed. The three women pressed their faces to the window and gasped. Before their very eyes, they saw an assortment of dolls, gaily painted wooden ducks, and other pull toys, stuffed animals, and a toy train moving towards the dormitory all by themselves. "I don't believe my eyes," whispered Sister Magdalene. "It's a miracle," the others chorused in hushed voices. "It's a miracle." They stood at the window for several seconds, watching as the last of the toys entered the dormitory. Then they lifted their long skirts and ran as fast as they could to see what had made the toys seemingly come to life and march into the children's dormitory. When they reached the doorway and looked in, they saw in the dim light that one toy was at the foot of each child's cot. How they got there and what power gave them life is not known to this day. But when the children awakened the next morning and found their gifts, they began to shout, in Chinese of course, "Santa didn't forget us. It was Santa. It was. The three sisters smiled at each other, and they knew that indeed Santa had not forsaken their little orphans that Christmas. As to how the toys managed to come to life and march under their own power that night, no one knows. But three Catholic sisters were witnesses. However, they have never stopped wondering if the strange little plump Chinese they met on the bus that day had something to do with it. After all, he had a twinkle in his eye, and he was wearing a bright red kimono, wasn't he? But who ever heard of a Chinese Saint Nick? So this story is, I want to say it's typical, but it's kind of an aberration in a way, but it's the literary devices in this story make it kind of typical. It begins with a statement with an exclamation point. It ends with a questioning of reality, whether Santa Claus could be Chinese. It is really sentimental. It's written more as like a Twilight Zone episode. It kind of foreshadows the idea that this Chinese man that they met was Santa Claus by saying that there was something friendly and strangely familiar about him. But it was, this kind of story was taken, it was presented as a true story, and it was consumed by people, mostly younger individuals who are very naive, who would think that it was a true story. And I'm sympathetic to that. I remember being in the school library when I was growing up, and finding books, I don't know what it was, it might have been like Ripley's Believe It or Not or stuff, and something like that, reading about the curse of the Egyptian tombs and wholeheartedly believing it. It was in a book. If you turn the book over, there's a picture of the adult author on the back of the book. Why would adults lie? And, if they were lying adults, why would a whole group of adults, because it takes a whole group of adults to publish a book, get together and further that lie? That was something I could not comprehend. So the fact that an adult was telling me that there was a curse that was killing all the archaeologists, as I remember the story, who were visiting King Tut's tomb, that was enough to get me to believe it, even though I'm sure in that case as well, there was no documentation, no list of sources, no nothing to, well, probably very little to support the story. The battery on my camera is getting low, but I did want to read another story to you. This one is amazing. This is The Startling Phenomena of the Bouncing Babies. It's the fourth story in the book, and I love this. If this makes this book worth it to me. So, Mrs. Nancy Corso and her neighbor, Mrs. Abraham Kotar, formerly of Hastings Street, Detroit, Michigan, are two women who are convinced they saw something supernatural on the afternoon of April 20, 1959, and again on the afternoon of July 5, 1959. The two women are justified in their belief because what they witnessed on both occasions could not have been anything else but manifestations of a supernatural origin. How else was it possible for two small children to fall 3 stories out of a tenement window and land with a bounce, unhurt, then toddle away laughing and chortling just as though nothing had happened? There is no logical explanation. Or is there? While Mrs. Corso and Mrs. Kotar were standing on the sidewalk on the morning of April 20, chatting together as usual, you know how women do, while waiting for the mailman, they happened to glance up at the 3rd floor of a building across the street in time to see a sight that horrified them. 3-year-old David Lowery and his sister Louise, aged 2, were teetering precariously on the ledge outside their window. Before either woman could give the alarm, the children fell. They plunged straight down towards the concrete sidewalk and certain death. Mrs. Corso and Mrs. Cotar ran across the street screaming. They darted frantically between the cars driving by. When they reached the opposite sidewalk, they saw, to their utter relief and astonishment, little David and his sister sitting on their diapered bottoms, babbling playfully as if nothing unusual had happened. Neither child appeared harmed or frightened. Several other neighbor women came running towards them. They too had seen the children fall. One woman, whose face was as white as a freshly chalked wall, exclaimed, "It was a miracle. They bounced. They're not hurt. I can't believe it. It isn't possible." The Tot's mother, Mrs. Bertha Lowry, did not know her children had climbed out the bedroom window and fallen. When she was told, she fainted. 3 months later, on the afternoon of July 5, a Sunday, Mrs. Corso and Mrs. Cotar were driving home together after spending the day with their neighbors at a nearby park where they had been picnicking. In the heavy traffic ahead, they saw the bus, which was carrying many of their neighbors home. Hanging out of the rear window were the 2 Lowry children. Just as Mrs. Corso was commenting on the toddler's accident proneness, Mrs. Cotar screamed. The 2 children fell out of the window and landed in the street. Several cars and a truck following the bus swerved and applied the brakes. The truck ran over both children. Mrs. Corso jammed on the brakes of her car and leaped out. She ran over to the truck and looked underneath as the crowd of people gathered. David Lowry, his face begrimed and his diaper nearly off, impishly grinned up at her from behind the truck wheel. A moment later, Louise, his little sister, crawled out and began to cry. Neither child was injured, much to the disbelief and astonishment of all present who had witnessed it. Neither Mrs. Corso nor Mrs. Cotar can offer any other explanation for what they saw with their own eyes than to admit that something supernatural is looking after the Lowry children. The odds against something like this occurring twice in a row to the same 2 children are astronomical, to say the least. Children just don't fall 3 stories to concrete sidewalks or fall out of speeding buses and land under the wheels of motor vehicles without being harmed, unless there is some unknown power protecting them, or unless they are children of the supernatural. Mrs. Corso and Mrs. Cotar have never forgotten the bouncing Lowry babies and have kept in touch with their mother, who informed them about 8 years later that both children once again had been involved in an accident, and once again they emerged unharmed. The children were at an amusement park, riding the whip, when the hurling vehicle became derailed and flung them more than 50 feet through the air. They landed on a sidewalk without a scratch. Those who had witnessed the horrifying accident could not believe their eyes. The children bounced. Yeah. There's some really funny stuff in this book. There's some really interesting stuff. One of the standout stories is one of the last ones. There's a past life regression story that almost makes me think it was written by someone else. I'd commented earlier about his lack of sources, and I almost think that he might have been looking in like paranormal journals or something like that as sources for these books, or for these stories. Oh, there's another thing I have to read you. So, story number 32. I think it's called The Child in the Floating... Let me just find it. So, story number 32, The Child in the Floating Coffin. So, this story is basically about these 2 people who are driving, and while they're driving, they see in the middle of the road, floating in front of them, a coffin just floating with a child in it. And then they go to their destination, and they find that the son or daughter of who they were visiting has died, and the coffin with the child is in the middle of the room. So what they had seen was a vision of this child before anyone had told them that the child had died. But the dialogue as they see this is, I thought, pretty hilarious. So George Keane instinctively slammed on the brakes and stared at the object. Suddenly, Loretta Keane cried out, "Oh my God, there's a little girl in that casket. It's the Morgan's child, Victoria." "Well, I'll be doggone if you aren't right. But I don't get it. What are we seeing? Coffins just don't float in midair on backcountry roads." "Please, George, let's get out of here. I'm scared," Loretta Keane begged. George needed no coaxing. He put the car in gear and drove away as fast as he could. Later on, he says, "What do you make of it, Loretta?" "I don't know. It's frightening and unbelievable. Here we are on our way to visit the Morgans with that brand new bicycle in the trunk for Victoria, and all of a sudden we see that mirage. What do you think it means?" George nodded, unable to answer. Maybe we were seeing things. Maybe it was a mirage. So, I said that I was Googling some of the names in the stories. He does provide names and places, and, a lot of times I'll find actors who have the same names, but they were born in different years. They would not have been children at the dates that these stories would have taken place. One thing I found which was very interesting, which may give a sense for like the origin and the lineage of these types of stories, is a 1998 book called Strange But True by Thomas Sleman. The third story in this text, called Alice in the Looking Glass, it's about a little girl who has an imaginary friend, or was she, in the mirror that she talks to. This story is also repeated, so this book was 69 and then 88, so that was like 19 years later, by a different author who adds different details to the story that are not present in this work, Children of the Supernatural. I only discovered this through a Google view of some of the pages of the book Strange But True. So I don't know if Thomas Sleman has sources, but that would be an interesting line of inquiry. Perhaps Thomas Sleman and Robert Tralins were looking at the same source, and perhaps Robert Tralins did not make up these stories after all. Anyway, thank you for tagging along with me as I have been talking for this last little bit of time. I appreciate you listening, and let me know if you want to hear any more of this type of thing. I had the idea of doing maybe one of these a month, but I think that would be pending whether this is actually any good, whether people will enjoy listening to it, it's something to fill the time. It's a whole big box of really interesting stuff that I've been wanting to get into since I acquired it maybe about 10 years ago. So I think that this making a vlog about it in this way gives me a excuse to do that. If you think it's worth, well, here's a couple things to ask you. I want to ask you if you think this is worth creating a dedicated YouTube channel to put these out maybe once a month. For the moment, it's on just kind of my old YouTube channel that I use for just casually perusing and stuff. So let me know what you think. Thank you for watching, and I hope to one day see you again in the real world, or maybe not. Maybe we'll just talk online, which is fine too. I'll see you later. Bye.